So welcome everybody. We're thrilled to have you here today. I'm MJR and I will be your moderator. We're going to have an in-depth discussion on travel data security and going over some best practices for TMCs, CTDs, and agencies. We're going to discuss things like breaches, phishing, ransomware, and some other common security issues. We will have a pretty robust session and we have time carved out at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them into the chat box and we will be sending out a recording of this call afterwards. So joining me today are Bob Bellis and Mike Duffy. So quick introductions. Bob, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure, Bob Bellis, GRAS Technologies. I'm the Chief Infrastructure Officer and been here for 25 years and hope to impart some information that I've learned along the way. And Mike Duffy, go ahead.
All right, Mike Duffy. I oversee a product at GRASP, but in previous life I worked at two TMCs where I was responsible for their IT needs, and so I understand the challenges around data security, and looking forward to getting Bob's thoughts around best practices. So yeah, back to you, MJR.
Wonderful. So we will just dive in. Bob, first off, can you give us your background on security?
Sure. Well, being that I've been here for so long, I've kind of had a couple of different hats that I've worn, but certainly in the last 10 to 15 years has been pretty heavy into data security and infrastructure, just securing the assets, technology assets that we have here, and certainly the data that we consume from our clients.
And Bob, for non-technical people, we're hearing a lot of security terms, PCI, ransomware, that sort of thing. What do you think would be the sort of like the top three issues or challenges that we should be looking at, or are there a top three, or is it everything?
Yeah, it would be kind of hard to pick just three, but if you had to, you would probably want to start with training, right? So if you want to think about data security and securing your assets within a company, you can look at it similar to how you would secure your home and your family, right? So, if you have kids, you certainly don't send them out to the world without any information or knowledge to how to handle certain situations. I'm sure every parent in the world has said at least once, stranger danger, right? And if we're doing that with our own family, we should do that with our employees. And so that's one big initiative we have at GRASP, and I would think that a lot of organizations would do this also, is train. You really need to train your employees what to look out for, how to recognize a phishing attack, how to handle data on a day-to-day basis, who you share it with. And that goes from the top down, from the CEO level down to every employee needs to have buy-in. We're from a security standpoint, we're all in this together, and you can't have a weak link in the chain or it'll fail. And all you need is one weak link.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to pick a second. Again, just like your home, you have a security system, right? And you lock your doors at night and maybe your windows. So you need to have some kind of perimeter defense or security. So firewalls certainly are important, antivirus, malware detection. All those applications and devices out there are designed for a reason, and it's to protect data and ensure the security of your assets within your organization. So those are some important things. And then, maybe patching is probably the last one I would mention. You need to have a good patching system where you're confident that the assets you have in your organization are being patched on a regular basis. So if you think about it, when a vulnerability is announced out to the world and there's a patch for it, that's just like an advertisement to the rest of the world. So everybody in the world knows that that's a vulnerability. And so the systems that aren't getting patched in a reasonable time, with maybe 30 days from when that patch comes out, hackers are just looking for that vulnerability. And if you look at the major corporations that have been hacked over the last 20 years, typically those are organizations that have been lax in their patching capability or just slow to act. Now, in their defense, they'll say, well, if we patched it, it would have broken our systems and we didn't really have a good mitigation process for it. But what's the alternative, right? You can not patch your system and get hacked or patch it and have to work around those issues. So I would think you would want to fail on the making sure your systems are as secure as possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I had to pick another one, I would say know where your data is, right? I mean, in the travel industry, it's a popular phrase, right? Know where your travelers are, right? You should know where your data is. Data mapping is increasingly important to security, certainly GDPR and PCI and SOC and all those things. You're required to know what data you have, right? And then where you have it at. So if it's on internal systems, if you're sending it to other companies, if you have third-party vendors that data is going to, it's really important to have a handle on where that is, and to a degree vetting out those vendors that you're sending the data to is important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do any sort of systems make it more protected than others, like cloud, for instance, versus on-premise? Is it better for protection, against those sort of hackers and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I don't know the cloud is, I would say, any more secure. Inherently, cloud comes with some more security tools built into it, but you still have to configure those. You have to purchase them and configure them. But you can do those same things with an on-prem system. There might be slightly more readily available for you just to turn on and turn off, maybe, as opposed to finding a vendor, implementing that system. So maybe ease of use would be a leg up on cloud systems as opposed to having to do it all yourself, because then you have to do all the research and all that good stuff. Where if you go with cloud, those tools are there. The problem with that, though, to a degree, is that you're a little bit stuck, right? If you're in Azure, if you're going to use Azure's tools. If you're at AWS, you're going to use AWS tools. If you're on-prem, you have more of a selection. So it depends on just how much bandwidth you have within an organization to be able to do the research on the other products to be able to implement those. So it's hard to say that cloud is any more secure or less secure than on-prem systems, really.
Okay. Well, then I guess, simply put, how would we eliminate risk? How do you do that?
Sure. Well, it's impossible to completely eliminate risk, right? I mean, unless you went to, you had no internet, you had no email, you had no data, but then you're not really a company. So I'm not sure that's a realistic expectation. But you want to mitigate it as much as possible, right? And you do that through, kind of the things I talked about before. Certainly, training is a huge part of mitigating risk. The less risky behavior your employees are experiencing, the better. How you're backing up your data, how you're securing it, and then big one from a risk mitigation standpoint is having that disaster recovery plan. So having a way to, if you do have an incident, how do you come back from it, right? Do you have a plan, and do you practice the plan on some annual or semi-annual basis? Those are really important to have a good kind of a risk situational awareness, right? To kind of self-assess where your organization is, how much risk you're willing to take on, and then kind of poking and prodding. That's one of the good things about going out and getting a compliancy, whether it's a SOC 2 or whether it's PCI or ISO, is when that happens and a third party comes in and starts asking all those questions, they'll come up with things that you never thought of, right? But they also kind of train you to be that type of person also, where you're asking the questions yourself, right? Where are the holes in my organization from a security posture standpoint, right? What can we do better? And that's something we have to ask ourselves all the time. And those are the types of practices you need to do to mitigate that risk as much as possible. And at the end of the day, again, the home analogy, insurance is never a bad practice to do research on, right? They have specifically cybersecurity insurance these days that you probably should do some research, but worth doing some research on, that certainly can come in handy in a pinch if you get into that situation.
Right. And so just thinking of various platforms and what you feel is sort of the weakest security, no, I guess not platform, but what would be the weakest link in security?
Well, by far the weakest links are always the employee, right? If you're not training and you're not making your employees aware of potential, if they can't identify a phishing email from another email, then you're really putting yourself at risk, right? Everybody has kind of seen those emails come in, right, that look like they're from the president or the CEO. The real common one is, hey, can you hurry up and go out and give me some gift cards so I can, there's always that part of the phishing email that's speed, right? Hurry up and do this quick, and they often target new employees in that type of scenario. So that's a big one, is that social engineering piece and phishing of going after employees, right? There was a time when everybody thought that a lot of these things were anonymous, right? That they were just broadcasting out these phishing emails to millions of people at the same time. But the more we learn, we realize, and certainly we've experienced this at Grasp, but that they're very aware of the organizational structure, right? They know who the presidents and the C-level people are, and they certainly are aware when there's a new employee, whether they're getting that through LinkedIn or how they're making that connection. They are, because typically a new employee will get hammered with those type of phishing exercises or expeditions.
Right. So that there's a lot of sort of engineering on social media. They're getting information from there and sort of using that to exploit the employees.
Right, for sure.
Right. Okay. Let's do a couple of quick fire security terms. Let's demystify some terminology, because I know there's a lot of acronyms and in IT, and so let's see if we can pick your brain on that. So
Sure.
let's start with if you can put into layman's terms, what's PCI?
PCI is what stands for Payment Card Industry. It's a security standard put in place by the major credit card companies, Visa, MasterCard, and Discover. Came up with this. I think it's a good 10 years old now, at least. And there's two types of compliances, right? You can do a self-assessment with PCI, which is essentially finding a vendor out there where you can get a vulnerability scan of the perimeter of your network, and then you fill out a questionnaire as truthful as possible, and then you get a certification back, right? But if you're handling a certain amount of credit cards, either processing them or they're just coming into your system, then you're required to go through a third-party audit of PCI, which we do at Grasp Technologies. We have a company called Security Metrics that comes in twice a year. Actually, we're in the middle of our audit right now. And, it's one of those, it's sometimes painful and uncomfortable to go through those, but like a lot of things in life, those are places where you can gain the most. And certainly we've learned a lot when we go through our PCI audits. Like I'd said before, when you have an auditor come in and they're looking in the closets, you know what I mean? And they're finding places that you didn't think of maybe. I think they're extremely helpful when you're talking about just securing your own infrastructure and the data that you're taking care of.
Okay. Another term then, multi-factor.
Multi-factor or two-factor authentication. You can think of that as, in simple terms, as something and then something you have, right? So typically the thing is your username and password. A lot of us see multi-factor authentication when logging into our banks, right? More and more applications are requiring, especially online applications are requiring a second factor of authentication. And that second thing is usually the have, right? Which is, in the old days, it was like a little key fob, right? They would generate a code every 30 seconds, right? Nowadays, most likely we're getting our two-factor from our phones, either through a text message The one we use at Grasp is called Duo. It's a widely very popular tool where we just get a pop-up on our phones that we can either approve or deny when we're trying to get access into the systems. They're great. They're specifically designed to kind of thwart the username and password credential hacking, right? So let's say you've given up your username and password accidentally, or it's been stolen somewhere along the way, right? Certainly those are purchased by certain hacking groups or individuals. And so by having that second form of authentication or 2FA on our phones, it allows us that if someone's logging into something with our username and passwords, we'll still be alerted, right? And we can't hit deny and keeping them from getting in. So it's a great tool. It's not perfect. We've noticed some vulnerabilities over certainly the last 12 months with 2FA, but it's very helpful.
Okay. Here's another term we used a moment ago, but if you can give some more detail on it, ransomware.
Yeah, ransomware is most common, and most people hear about ransomware, right? But most commonly, it's someone or these hacking organizations are really organizations, right? They have gotten access into your system and they've encrypted your data usually, and typically they leave a note behind, and that lets you know that they've been in your system and they've encrypted everything, and they will provide the decryption key to be able to decrypt all this data if you provide them with X amount of money, right? Usually in the form of Bitcoin or some kind of cryptocurrency. There are certainly success stories of people paying the ransom and getting the decryption key. There are even kind of less malicious actors when they do this, right? Where they'll actually say, hey, this is how we got into your system. We're doing you a favor. We're only going to charge you a nominal amount of money to decrypt that. Now, if that's kind of wishful thinking to think that that's what you're going to get. Most of the time, and depending on the size of the organization, I'm guessing they understand what an organization is worth and probably value the ransom payment dependent on what kind of organization they get to or they can hack. And certainly over the years, that number that they're asking for has gone up and up and up and up. So, in the old days, it was $300 or $1,000, and now it's $30,000 to $1 million for organizations, right? Kind of the second tier of that ransomware is where if you don't pay, then they threaten to then just take all your data and put it out on the dark web for anybody to see, right? So they're trying all the tricks in the book at this point to try to get you to pay that ransom.
Right.
A lot of those organizations are highly functional. I think there was a recent article that just came out that actually talked about ransomware organizations being run like a real business with HR departments and employee reviews and performance, bonuses based on, what they collect. And so, yeah, these ransomware organizations are getting highly sophisticated.
Wow. That's scary.
Yeah.
Another term then, let's if you could demystify PII.
Yeah, well, certainly in the travel industry, we've seen more discussion around PII just with the GDPR. So GDPR came out in 2016, I think or 2017 is when they finally ratified it with the EU. And what it says essentially is that if you're housing any PII data or personally identifiable information, that you need to handle it in a certain way, similar to PCI, to how you would handle credit card data, right? You need to encrypt it at rest, and you need to know where it's at, and you need to certainly be aware of who you're sharing with it, who you're sharing that data with. So yeah, that's becoming. When I think about PI data, I always kind of stop and think, it's personal data, right? So as an organization, you should probably handle it the same way that you would want another organization handling your personal data, right? When you buy something from Amazon, or when you do something on a social media platform, you'd like to think that there's some amount of privacy with that, right? And PII, the regulations around PII with GDPR, and soon there'll be an EU-US compliance regulation, so similar to GDPR with the US and the EU with how we're handling personal information and not, just taking care of it, being good stewards of that data.
Can you tell me a little bit on phishing? It sounds a lot more friendly than, say, ransomware, but I know it's not good either. So if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, there are several forms of phishing, right? I mean, it can be done over the phone, and certainly we've all heard, your grandparent got called by the IRS and they told you to get out money to send them to, right? But from a corporate level or business standpoint, we see it mostly in email, right? So some examples are like I had said before, the CEO or someone in the accounting department, their email has been impersonated. Hey, can you do something for me, right? They want something from you, either monetarily or they're trying to get your credentials. Credential harvesting is a huge part of phishing. So they want that username and password. So that's a big part of phishing is social engineering someone to get information out of them. And it could be anything, right? It's not just username and password. It could be phone number, or it could be, sometimes they are not as malicious. They're fairly benign, but sometimes, you get the username and passwords of somebody in your organization in the wrong hands and they can do a lot of damage. So it can be quite damaging.
Yeah. Okay. And then just one last term to demystify, print manager or print module.
Demystify. So certainly,
I know it's not a security edge, but I just threw that in there.
It could be, right? I mean, when you think about it, there's PII data and PNR data that comes down to an organization. So,
yeah,
print manager is typically a way for PNR data to come from the GDS down to the agency level to be imported into a back office system somehow or reported on. And certainly we see this a lot in Grasp Cloud because we do hosting for agencies and we host a lot of print managers, right? So Amadeus has their new SAP version of it, Sabre Print Module, Host Print Manager, Galileo Print Manager, all those wonderful print managers. Yeah.
Yes. And how does one know if enough is being done on security? Like a non-technical person, what questions would they ask if they have an IT team, or how much do they budget? Is there any sort of gauge that you could suggest?
Yeah, but budget's kind of hard. We've seen the number, like around $3,000 per employee per year is what you should be budgeting from a security standpoint. I'm not sure how they quite arrived at that number, but I think you need to have a good level of trust, right? I think you start with those questions that I asked before. What's your patching policy? What's the expectation for how soon operating systems and applications need to be patched? How are you verifying they've been patched, right? What's your notification system on how they're getting patched? How's data encrypted, right? If we're sending data out to other vendors, are we encrypting that data in transit? Is it getting encrypted at rest? Data mapping, like I mentioned before, right? Where's your data? Is it sitting at a vendor's site? Is that data vendor secure? Those are all things that I would think an IT, whether internal or external, should be providing some insight on. And then I would think they would be heavily involved in some kind of disaster recovery, because they're going to be needed, right? If a disaster happens or an incident occurs, they're going to be heavily involved in rebuilding systems or restoring things from backup. So that's where I would start. And training, right? Are they going to be involved in the yearly or biannually or quarterly training program? And how's that going to happen? Something we do at Grasp that I didn't mention before, but I think a lot of organizations should do is they should do there's there's lots of tools out there that do the phishing campaigns, right? So a lot of organizations today have Microsoft 365, we do, and we use the phishing tool to simulate a phishing attack, right? And we want to see how our employees do when they receive a phishing email. You know, do they recognize it? Do they contact somebody on the IT team to say, hey, is this legitimate? Those are important things, is to know, you know, not only how to recognize something like that, but who to contact if one, you know, if they got it. Two, God forbid, if they, well, not God forbid, if they put their credentials in, right? It's not the end of the world if they fail a phishing campaign, right? If you've put the phishing attack out there to kind of test their knowledge on it, it's okay. It's a learning experience, right, for everybody involved. If you can go back to them and go, here, this is the things that you missed on this one, learn from it, move on, do better next time. So those are really important things.
But they're getting more and more sophisticated. I remember, you know, years ago, you know, there'd always be, you know, graphic errors or grammatical errors in them, and they're getting so sophisticated now. You know, a couple of best practices that I share with people is, you know, if anything's coming inbound asking you for your credentials, if you go to the website direct, they're going to ask you there as well. So, you know, for a personal practice, I never click anything asking for my credentials in an email. I'll go to the platform or the application. And usually when you log in, they're asking you to do the same thing that they asked in the email. And then the other thing is I never reply to an email because they spoof the email addresses so well. So if I get something like that and I wanted to forward it on and say, hey, is this legit? I actually hit the forward button instead of reply. And then for my personal address, send it to the person I wanted to. So if our CEO sent me something, I wouldn't hit reply back. I would hit forward, type in Eric and go, did you really send this to me? That way they can't mask their email address and get you that way either.
Right. I mean, you know, we're lucky enough to have a close organization where everybody's pretty open, right? And it's not a big deal to email the president of the company and go, hey, are you sure you want this information from me, type of thing. But, you know, some organizations are larger, right? And they really need that understanding of who to go to, who to communicate that if they're unsure in those situations. That's really important. You know, security is everybody is involved in it, right? If it's no longer just the IT team or the security team, it's everybody. And you really have to have, you know, you have to have top-down buy-in, right? You got to have your CEO level people bought into it, because that's how you're going to get your, you know, everybody else bought into it.
Yeah. So is that if someone was to have a takeaway from this webinar, what would that be then? Would that be it?
Yeah, that would be good. I mean, I still think training is the best bang for your buck, for sure. Train.
Okay. All right, and I think that's all the questions I had. I get over to you, MJR, if there's any other questions.
Yeah, wonderful. We've got a couple in the Q&A box, and if anybody else has any questions, feel free to drop them in now. Bob, of all the risks out there today, what would you recommend a business to focus on first? Phishing, ransomware, something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have a multi-layered approach. I think you find a good training tool. You make sure that all the employees are attending those training sessions. You have a way to kind of verify that. Again, that's what I mentioned earlier with the phishing campaign tools that are available out there. I think those are very valuable. We use them quite a bit at Grasp. And then I think you have to patch. You know, it's not very sexy. It's not terribly, you know, technically sophisticated. But if you're not patching the known vulnerabilities, then you're doing your organization a great disservice. So I would start with those two.
Wonderful. I'll layer in a question that made me just think about it. You know, we all know there's the annual security certifications, but is there a best practice around frequency of training people? Is this something that should be done, you know, annually, twice annually, quarterly?
At least twice a year. At least twice a year, for sure. And I would do something quarterly. You know, I think it's a good idea to kind of split it up, right? If you're doing the same presentation twice a year, people are just going to gloss over, right? You got to keep it interesting. You got to test them. Yeah, so at least twice a year for sure.
Okay. So somebody asked a question around, threats to the business, but would you recommend anything different for personal versus just general security practices? So it's like personal versus business, it sounds like.
Yeah. I think they both. I think it's very easy to apply to both, right? A lot of people for years were just like, well, I'm going to do this at work, but at home in my personal business dealings, I don't have to worry about that. But 2FA has become so common. But I always say 2FA everything you can, right? If you got a bank account that's not providing two-factor authentication, you should probably think about not banking with them. At least that's my personal opinion. Physical security is something we don't talk about enough about really, but I always have in my training presentation is never leave your laptop in the car. During the pandemic, this wasn't as much of a thing, but I imagine it'll come back as people working at coffee shops, right? You go to Starbucks, you plug in your laptop and you work. Everybody's working from remote locations, right? You have to secure those assets. Make sure, for one thing, you've got, passwords on all those things that you're securing them. And then, don't leave your laptop in the car. Don't walk away from your phone or your laptop. Those are assets that are important, right? If you're thinking about two-factor authentication, you've got your phone and you got your laptop, someone gets both of those, you're in trouble, It's not a good situation to be in. So physical security is important, it's so easy to get a camera at home, to plug in. Again, you have a nanny cam, right? You watch your children sleep sometimes. You should put them up in your house to make sure people aren't getting in. So physical security is important.
Wonderful. Someone asks, seems there is a lot of error with autofill and email addresses to and from accounts. Any suggestions?
Yeah, there has been some discussion about whether the browser-based password managements are sufficient from a security standpoint. I know Google and Edge have done a better job of securing those lately. So they're better than they were. I love LastPass. I think that's a really good, strong tool to use. It'll not only manage passwords, but its vaulting is more secure certainly than storing them in your browser. But that's another, that's a valid thing to think about. And I think that's the right way to think, right? I think you have to just sit and think through where your vulnerabilities are, right? Storing passwords in a browser is certainly one of them. And you need to kind of vet out whether that's a good place to store them or if you need to look at a third party to do it.
Then expanding on that, someone asks, is there a resource guide available about all the best practices and recommendations around what training to offer employees? Do you think of a resource for that?
Yeah, so NIST, N-I-S-T, is a really good resource. And then I tell you what, if you go through a PCI third-party audit or a SOC 2 audit, they're going to provide a lot of those tools to you. I mean, that's usually part of the audit process is getting those in place. So yeah, I would start there.
Beautiful. Any other questions? Okay, I don't see anything new. So just so everybody knows, besides sending the recording of this, GRASP is also going to be putting together an article and a white paper around this topic in the future, and specifically how all of this relates to the travel industry and travel data. So keep your eyes open for that as well. So thank you, Bob. Thank you, Mike. Hopefully everybody got a lot of value out of this. If you have any other questions, we are an email away. Reach out to GRASP or reach out to Bob, and we would be happy to have a conversation and continue to talk, best practices around security and data security. Wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody have a fantastic day. Thank you again. Cheers.
Take care.